When you think of Activision's tenure with the Bond license, you probably think of a few specific things. First-person shooters, inspired by their other massive IP, and games that follow a narrative of a film, or films in the case of Legends. But right in the middle of that era lies a complete structural contradiction. In 2010, alongside the reimagining of GoldenEye, 007 Bloodstone was released, and it didn't follow the script of a movie. It didn't run on a standard shooter engine, and it wasn't a first-person shooter at all. Instead, it was an original narrative built from the ground up as a third-person shooter, and it is by far the most unique and radically different title of Activision's 4-game run, and arguably the best received, even if the review scores don't paint that pretty of a picture. So, how did the black sheep of an otherwise predictable run become the most interesting cult classic of them all? Well, let's take a look. Right when you boot up Bloodstone, you might notice something. It's all pretty slick. And one of the first things that stood out to me about Bloodstone is how well presented it all is. For a game that's 16 years old, it looks great. The UI is slick, it has a well-informed and cohesive aesthetic that's all in keeping with the vibe that it's trying to sell, and the graphics and art direction is all pretty top-notch. And again, I want to remind you that this is from 2010, and even now, it all looks pretty great. The cast is all back too, so to match the slick tone, we've got Daniel Craig as Bond, Judi Dench as M, and Rory Kinnear as Tanner. And I've got to say, as someone who pointed out Craig's less than stellar voice acting in the past, I do genuinely think that it's his best work in the series. And that goes a long way in tandem with the slick presentation set by all of the other visuals. And on a related note too, the sound design isn't bad either, which absolutely was an issue with GoldenEye that released that same year. So overall, Bloodstone is a seismic cut above all the other games when it comes to basic production value, which is a nice change of pace and something that I'd actually forgotten. So it isn't rose-tinted glasses talking, I genuinely think that this game looks fantastic, even today. And actually, another part of the production that I think goes the extra mile is the intro, which, as we all know, is central to a good Bond story, and here it doesn't disappoint either. And like I've already said, in comparison to the other games, it doesn't even come close. And this is by far the best Bond intro from the entire Activision catalogue, and is only a little bit let down by the music, which is neither here nor there really, but I can't show it you because of copyright, so you'll have to take my word for it. Now, I think this chasm when it comes to the production value is entirely down to who developed it, because while the other games from the era were either rushed or outsourced, Bizarre Creations took the helm with Bloodstone, which might seem like a bit of an odd choice, well, because it is, really. They're a studio known for developing racing games like Project Gotham Racing or, at the time, more recently, Blur. And both are well regarded in their own right, but Bizarre only had one other third-person shooter in their back catalogue, and frankly I find it really odd in this context, but it definitely explains the palpable shift in production value because, in my opinion, I think they're a studio that does a fantastic job of making their games look polished, and it's no different here with Bloodstone. Anyway, history lessons aside, the game looked great, which just makes it even more brutal and, well, bizarre that it was Bizarre Creations' final game. Right then, so what about the game? Well, like I said, it's the only third-person shooter from the Activision catalogue, and while Quantum of Solace did have a third-person cover perspective, Bloodstone is entirely third-person, which means that you can always see Bond's full body, and you can see around corners and all of that. And honestly, I think that fits Bond games a bit better and helps set them apart from the obvious plague of the Call of Duty clone allegations, which we all know too well. And when it comes down to gameplay, I'd say Bizarre Creations did an okay job. It's not ultra responsive, and aim assist does indeed do a lot of heavy lifting, which can make it feel a little bit too easy and to some degree a little bit floaty. So the polish you see visually isn't entirely matched when it comes to the game feel, which is a shame. But it's by no means a bad game mechanically, and I'd describe it as serviceable and not so distracting that it takes you out of the game. It's just a little too simple and far too shallow, and at times it can feel like the game's doing all the shooting for you, which isn't great. But on the whole, you'll have definitely played a whole load of 360-era games that feel way worse, and you certainly couldn't say that Bloodstone feels janky, if that makes any sense. So mechanically speaking, it's as straightforward as it gets. You move, shoot, and you take cover. And then you have this focus aim mode, which lets you instantly drop enemies in a stylized burst of what you could call bullet time. And you can stack up to 3 of these instant kill charges, and you earn them by performing hand-to-hand takedowns. And the melee itself is equally basic. You literally just press X when you're next to a guy and watch the animation play out. It looks cool, but like the rest of the package, there's no real depth to it. And every combat arena is filled with ample cover and enemies that have a habit of mindlessly running straight towards you, in a way that's, well, shall we say, not very clever. It's all textbook 2010 Xbox 360 games. It looks fantastic, but fundamentally it's a very simple ride. And speaking of rides, since it's Bizarre Creations, there are actually a few mandatory driving sections spread throughout the campaign. And honestly, I think they're pretty good, at least in the broader context of the Activision Bond catalogue. Without sounding like a broken record, the visuals in these set pieces are where the game easily looks its absolute best, which really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. The moment you finally get behind the wheel of the Aston Martin, you notice a massive shift in feel, and it's almost as if you're finally taking control of the game in the way that the developers intended. It's nothing radically complex, but the driving just clicks in a way that feels rehearsed and weighty and far more tactile than the foot combat. And again, just look at the screen. The presentation during these chases is stellar, and I can't really fault it. Now, there are a couple of sequences where the action gets so chaotic that it's a bit hard to see what's going on. And I did end up plunging through the holes in the ice more than a few times on this specific level. But on the whole, the set pieces feel incredibly authentic to the franchise, and the whole game is slick in a very specific, traditional 007 way. And there's countless moments where you'll notice the developers actively paying homage to the films. And specifically, the first car chase has Quantum of Solace written all over it, and the intro animation and black and white scenes are clearly pulling direct inspiration from Casino Royale. It all fits seamlessly into that grounded and gritty Craig-era tone, and I genuinely think that Bizarre Creations understood the assignment here and managed to build something that's completely original, yet familiar and standout in all of the right ways, which is a massive accomplishment in its own right. Okay then, let's talk about the story, and before we even get started, I want to ask one simple question. Where is the Bloodstone? And at what point is this thing actually spoken about, shown, or even vaguely referenced in this entire game? I swear, I had to look this up online only to find countless other people asking the exact same question. And for this being the literal title of the game, the idea that it's the jewel embedded in a knife that you get threatened with once is, well, a little bit erroneous to say the least, and you barely even see it. In fact, the whole cinematic where you're finally told about it, it's described as platinum, and are tactical knives usually made out of platinum? I don't know. Either way, when I played it back in 2010, I do actually remember thinking, wait, where's the Bloodstone? And even now, as a supposedly more discerning adult, I still find myself a little bit unsure. The whole thing feels a bit weird, or bizarre, shall we say, because the narrative actually revolves around bioweapons and terrorism, and not diamonds or the black market at all. And the only time it's really vaguely mentioned is when you meet the woman who designs jewelry and apparently commissioned this knife. So it's all pretty cryptic and never properly explained, and I don't really know why the game leans so heavily on it as to title the whole thing about it, so I thought that was a bit odd, to say the least. But you know what? There is actually one good hidden detail in that title, and it's how Bloodstone perfectly fits the Craig-era 00 marketing theme. Because back then, the film posters always incorporated this 00 into the words themselves, something they entirely skipped on doing with Skyfall for obvious reasons and much to my immense disappointment. And think about it, they had the O in blood and the O in stone right there. They could have stacked them right on top of each other to get that iconic vertical 007 stylized cover art. But no, they didn't do that. And why not, Activision? It was sitting right there and you didn't do it. Anyway, pointless details aside, the story isn't that much to write home about, and I suppose you could say that it's a match for the simple gameplay, but it's just a tick in the it'll do box for the game, and not really that bad that it takes you out of it. So, you know, unlike the missed opportunity with the cover art, it's not that big of a deal. And beyond the cryptic title and missed graphic design opportunities, there's another elephant in the room that we need to address, and that is the length. Bloodstone is a remarkably short game, and if you're playing through on the standard difficulty, you can easily breeze through the entire game in about 3 to 4 hours. And it's the kind of game that you sit down to play after lunch and finish before dinner, which feels a bit lean even by 2010's linear shooter standards. And I think a huge reason it feels so brief is the total lack of mechanical friction, specifically when it comes to your gadgets and the overall flow of the gameplay. Traditional Bond games usually give you an arsenal of laser watches, exploding pens, or remote mines to experiment with, which naturally slows down the gameplay as you figure out how to bypass certain obstacles and play more creatively. Now here, you only get a smartphone, and that's literally it. The phone acts as your map, your hack tool, and the mandatory X-ray vision, which is a bit cheap, but whatever. And whenever you come to a locked door, you'll pull out your phone, follow the on-screen prompt, and basically move on. It's less about using spycraft to solve a problem and more about scanning a QR code that unlocks the next shooting gallery's door. And the same can be said for the stealth too. There's basically nothing to it, and you can't even crouch, which says all I need to say, really. While it does keep the screen clean and the cinematic pacing incredibly fast, it does strip away any sense of agency, and the game moves at this breakneck speed because it never really forces you to stop and think, and it's all very go, 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 and before you know it, it's over. Now, on one hand, I don't mind the more grounded phone and gun approach to the 007 formula, especially in the context of it being Daniel Craig's grittier, more modern take on the character. It makes sense in this era, but in Bloodstone, that loop feels more flat than it does gritty because the gunplay is already so simple. Stripping away the gadget variety leaves the whole package wanting a bit more depth. And right when you finally do find your groove and start getting into the rhythm of it all, the credits roll, and it's short, it's simple, and it leaves you wanting more, which I suppose is technically the definition of a good experience, but honestly, I can't fully make my mind up. Which more or less outlines my main issue with the game as a whole. I've established that it looks and sounds great, and it genuinely does, and in my opinion it stands alone as literally the most memorable Bond game of this entire era. But beyond the surface level sheen, it's otherwise so basic that there's just not much else to say. And honestly, I think that's exactly why people remember it so fondly. When something with this much sheer flair is sandwiched between an absolute disaster like 007 Legends and a title like Quantum of Solace, which, by the way, I still think is a bit of a diamond in the rough, but my point still stands, what you end up with is Bloodstone standing out. And it's not necessarily because it's a masterclass in game design, but because it's not Activision's other Bond games. It shifts the perspective. For at least a fleeting moment, Activision actually had the right vision and backed a studio that made a game which was more than just a lazy asset flip, and if it had received just one more game like the cliffhanger suggested, I do genuinely think that Bizarre Creations could easily have gone down as one of the more standout Bond developers. And honestly, all of the pieces were there. It had an original story, incredible presentation, and serviceable yet simple gameplay, which for the most part isn't a catastrophic bar to set, especially when you look at what happened with the industry after it. So, is Bloodstone the best Bond game in the world? No, definitely not. But is it Activision's best? Probably. But let's be real, it didn't really take that much doing, did it?
Nicole, down! Get down!
Bond? Are you there? Come in, 007. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
We've been concerned about you, 007. What happened?
I'm fine, Em. But I think you're gonna need a new contact in Monaco. If you need me, you know how to reach me. Bond out.